Welcome, everybody. The Department of East Asian Studies is delighted to welcome Dr. Eric Huntington. Eric completed his BA in the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Anthropology at Utah State University, and his MA and PhD in Anthropology at the University of Hawaii at, how do you say it correctly?
Manoa.
Manoa. As a grad student, he held a MEXT fellowship at Kyoto University and also conducted extensive fieldwork in the mountains of Naga Prefecture. After completing his doctorate in 2012, he was assistant professor for 1 year at Hosei Daigaku in Tokyo before taking his current post as assistant professor and chair of Japanese studies at Earlham College. Eric's first book, from which he'll speak today, is called The Unseen Forest, Spectacles of Nature and Governance in a Japanese National Forest. And this manuscript is in preparation for the University of Arizona Press's Critical Green Engagement Series. Eric has published a number of articles and chapters developing the methodology that he is going to showcase for us today, which he calls Unseen Spectacles. I'm saying that that's what he calls it. But he's using political ecology and critical media studies to talk about the cultural dimensions of ecological change, resource governance, and environmental politics. And we're really happy to learn more about this project today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can we cut the round?
Oh, yeah. Someone had even taught me how to do that. Let's see if that was the right
Yeah,
way. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Clapping for the light.
I think so.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Long, and other members of the search committee for bringing me to campus. And I haven't had a chance to speak to most of you, and so I'm looking forward to afternoon discussions and evening discussions as well. But thank you for coming and giving me this opportunity to share some of my research with you. So, as Dr. Long said, the title of my talk today is Unseen Forests, a Political Ecology of Forest Nature and Spectacle in Upland Japan. And I'd like to begin with a couple of images. And this first one is a representation of forests in the Kiso Valley of central Japan. It's an image that was produced by a branch office of the Japanese government's forestry agency, the Rinyacho, which governs the majority of the region's forests designated as national forests, or kokuyurin. In this image, which I've seen produced in a variety of media circulated by the forestry agency, we see forests depicted from above as large swaths of color. And the key to the bottom right of the image decodes, or it might be more appropriate to say that it encodes for viewers, the forests that are being represented here. Each of the colors refers to an ecosystem function that we are to conclude correlate either to modes of forest management or to actual ecological functions, or perhaps to both. And there's sort of finer gradients of these categories, but these main three are ones that I see reproduced in media over and over again. And these are water and land protection, or suido hozen, forest and people coexistence, or symbiosis, shinin to hito to no kyosei, and resource cycling, or shigen no junkan ryo. And I'll speak a bit more about each of these later in the talk. Now, this second image is a photograph that I took while living and conducting ethnographic fieldwork between 2008 and 2010 in the village of Otaki, which is located in the Kiso Valley region. In this image, Tajika-san, an amateur historian, is depicted clearing moss and debris from a statue in search of a year or a date to indicate when it was erected. I took this shot during a visit with other village residents to Sawado Toge, which is a small mountain pass that had once been a sort of rest stop for spiritual practitioners headed to the foot of the sacred Ontake-san, a mountain that stands just above the village. Tired travelers might have enjoyed bowls of soba noodles from a small shop located at the site while gazing at the round white peak of Ontake-san that at the time was framed by a large stone torii gate. The Kiso Valley-born author Shimazaki Toson also visited this place, and he mentions it in his novel Yoake Mae, Before the Dawn, writing, quote, "Here people could gaze up at the form of a great mountain that would prevail amidst the endless changes of the human world." And it was through visits like this to forest spaces typically unseen, and through interactions with residents like Tajika-san, who are intimately familiar with varied aspects of Otaki's environment, that I began to see within its forests vibrant ecologies that included people, shrines, sacred waterfalls, plants, pathways, trees, and mushrooms, among other things. Now, interestingly, these two images actually depict the same forest space, though they do so in radically different ways, of course. The forest where Chijika-san and I stood is represented, though it's unseen, in the Forestry Agency map. It's these kinds of divergences in ways of seeing or not seeing forest environments that are the analytical focus of my current book project, The Unseen Forest. And in it, I examine how globalized flows of discourses and images inform institutional productions of forest nature in Japan, with implications for local level human and non-human communities, material environments, and the ecologies they help to compose. I argue that discourses and images of nature, or what I refer to as nature spectacles, are key components of post-war regimes of national forest governance. And so by contrasting the ways in which forests are differentially seen or unseen at different levels, I trace how local communities and landscapes are transformed through nature spectacles, which I suggest draw them into broader domains of knowledge, value, and material production. At the same time, I also attend to the affective dimensions of interactions among humans, non-human animals, material environments, and spiritual beings that enliven local ecologies. Given these divergences in seeing and relating to forests, I suggest that human actors at the local level come to understand themselves and the environments they dwell in contested and contradictory ways that ultimately impact their capacities to sustain lively social and ecological communities. But my focus in today's talk is specifically on seen rather than unseen forests. And I describe how national forests in the Kiso Valley region are made to be seen through nature spectacles that are informed by understandings of scientific management, conservation, and sustainability, as well as notions of citizenship and a common national culture. My argument in this talk is that nature spectacles are critical to natural resource governance projects in the Kiso Valley because they present plausible realities and coherent landscapes that interact with material environments in ways that obscure historical political economies of resource extraction and the resultant precariousness of local ecologies. In my work of teasing apart what is seen and what remains unseen within context of national forest governance is informed by a political ecology approach that is attuned to operations of power within ecosystems, as well as an analysis that is historically situated, place-based, and multi-scalar. And I suggest that focusing attention on the seemingly transient realm of images and discourses, and considering how these mediate human interactions with environments, moves us towards a political ecology and forest governance in Japan by throwing light on 4 interconnected processes. And these are first, the transition of ecologically benign production systems to overexploitation through state development and integration into regional, national, and global markets. Second, the rendering technical of ecological issues by extracting conceptual representations from the messiness of life in order to formulate problems that call for intervention. And here I'm specifically speaking to images and discourses of eco-functional natures that I'll describe in more detail later. 3, the fetishization of nature and rurality within an ever-expanding accumulation of texts and images. And 4, the affirmation of nature spectacles through the emergence of subjects. My work is also informed by theories of assemblage that encourage us to think through vast sets of connections and relations among, quoting Anderson and McFarlane, heterogeneous elements that may be human and non-human, organic and inorganic, technical and natural. As I employ the term, assemblage also references heterarchical organization, meaning that, and here I quote from a recent article by Conway, Osterweil, and Thornburn, elements co-function in provisional wholes in which the behavior of constituent parts is conditioned but not determined by the whole, whereby the parts never lose their own integrity, their own difference. And so really I'm trying to look at relationships more than I am at objects and to see how emergences come out of those relationships. So my aim in employing theories of assemblage is to interrogate nature spectacles not as ideational forms that shape ways of thinking about material environments, but rather as forms that invade both material environments and the lived realities of all who dwell within. Moreover, by employing theories of assemblage to develop a political ecology perspective, my goal is to open a broader analytical space in which to interrogate normative claims about natural resource management conservation, and sustainability as sets of institutions and practices that are frequently or even always benign or beneficial to local ecologies. Doing so in the context of upland communities in Japan also offers novel top-down or upland to lowland vantage points from which to critically assess the nation's post-war economic prosperity and to better appreciate the ways in which environmental harm and precarity have been offloaded onto marginal communities in the crafting of economically productive national ecologies. And I think that some of this work is now being done in the post-311 world to think about how vulnerability and marginality were structured into environments, but there's much more work that could be done across the archipelago, and so I'm hoping to contribute to that. So in the rest of this talk, I developed my argument by first introducing the Kiso Valley region and Otaki village, and then offering a brief historical overview of resource development and exploitation in the region to suggest that these projects entail initial assemblage work of crafting what I call resource landscapes in that region. I then turned my attention to images and discourses of nature within current regimes of forest governance and described their power to obfuscate the actualities of local ecological and environmental transformation. And then finally I used the example of a multi-purpose dam in Otaki to speak to the ability of nature spectacles to present themselves as already real realities through the production of both landscapes and human subjects that positively affirm them. Unfortunately, my time today is not going to allow me to delve into the topic of unseen forests, and specifically my use of an affective ecologies framework to describe and think about sets of human-environment interactions that enliven local ecologies. But I would be happy to speak to this part of my research during the Q&A session or part of our conversations elsewhere. Okay. So the Kiso Valley region is an area of approximately 600 square miles located in the central Japanese prefecture of Nagano, about 250 miles west of the Tokyo metropolitan area. The Kiso itself is a river valley that runs north to south through the region with a number of smaller valleys that run perpendicularly into it from mountainous regions on both sides. Over 90% of the region is forested, and 62% of this is designated as national forest. In part due to its topographic profile, the Kiso Valley region is relatively isolated. And so in a country known for its extensive transportation network, the region is really somewhat of a backwater. A simple two-lane road and a single train line run up the length of the Kiso Valley, and that means that access to major rail lines or freeways is limited. You have to sort of go north or south first to get out of the valley. The village of Otaki sits in one of the small valleys that feeds into the Kiso, and it occupies a single watershed at the base of Ontake-san, the 3,000-meter volcanic mountain that I mentioned previously. There's no train station in Otaki, not a single traffic light, and much to the chagrin of children in the village, no convenience stores either. So like the rest of the Kiso Valley, the village's remoteness contributes to its marginal status within the nation and its inability to have meaningfully accessed economic prosperity in the period of high economic growth. Agriculture at an economically productive scale, for example, has never been viable, and so tourism, and particularly ski tourism, has been the main thrust of economic activity in the post-war period. However, as I've argued elsewhere, touristic projects have had mixed successes, both in Otaki and elsewhere, and frequently are accompanied by unexpected and undesirable social and environmental effects. And just a brief side note here, both in Otaki as well as sites in Kyoto and Okinawa prefectures are locations where I'm doing new field work and research on tourism for a second book project in which I think about the ways that local communities attempt to work with these nature spectacles or spectacles of rural communities as well in crafting tourism projects that work to sustain their local communities. Like many upland villages in Japan, Otaki has been labeled a Genkai Shuraku, and this term is variously translated as village at the edge or marginal village, but essentially references existential crises due to depopulation that is being fueled by exoduses of young people to urban areas because of lack of employment opportunities. So Otaki's present population stands at just over 700, and this is down from over 4,000 during the inter and immediate post-war years. Part of this initially was a bump because of industrialized forestry that I'll speak to in a moment, but the decline has been precipitous and ongoing. You can check their website almost daily to find the number going down. A 2007 program produced by NHK, Japan's National Broadcasting Corporation, labeled Otaki Oitsumerareta Mura, a cornered village. And this was in reference to its precarious geographical, economic, and social positions. I contend, however, that this precariousness has been fostered in great part through a history of state control of resources and accompanying projects of exploitation and development, which have transformed local production systems, ecologies, and environments. And so I turn to that next. Intensive resource exploitation has occurred in the Kiso Valley since at least the 16th century. However, it accelerated substantially beginning in the late 19th and early 20th century as timber extraction was industrialized under the Meiji government. This acceleration began with the enclosure of common use forests through the imposition of land taxes beginning in 1874. This was part of the larger Hanseki Hokan, or the return from feudal lords, return of land from feudal lords to the emperor. Following this, in 1903, was the establishment of the Imperial Forest Administration Bureau, the Teishitsu Rinnya Kyoku, as well as regional branch offices like the one shown here in places across the archipelago to facilitate forest management and timber production. In the Kiso Valley region, a forest railroad network also began to be built in 1907, and this eventually expanded throughout the entire region to enable more extensive and efficient timber extraction. And that rail network operated until the mid-1970s. By the end of World War II, forests throughout the Kiso Valley region, as well as many other parts of Japan, had been decimated due to overcutting, and this led one U.S. official writing in 1951 to label the situation a forest emergency. Demands for timber to support reconstruction efforts, however, immediately led to large-scale projects of tree planting or afforestation. So there was a series of emergency legislative acts that were done in the immediate post-war period to get people planting trees right away. These efforts, however, were not able to keep up with demand, and so in the 1960s, the Japanese government eased restrictions on imports of foreign timber, which rapidly depressed domestic timber markets, and those never fully recovered. However, replanting efforts did not substantially slow down, which meant that many upland areas in Japan entered into an era of overforestation and undermanagement. So it's this kind of counterintuitive way of thinking. Too many trees, particularly for local populations, is the way that they view this ecological shift that has happened. So to put this in simpler terms and also in visual terms, through this history of state-sponsored industrial forestry, followed by heavy planting focusing on coniferous timber varieties, Japan's domestic forests, and particularly its national forests, have been converted on large scales from diverse mixed ecologies to simple plantation-style ecologies, like this one, very simple sort of two-story forest. This history of industrialized state forestry is written on the mountainsides of Otaki. For example, the upper reaches of many of the steep slopes surrounding Takigoshi, a small hamlet located at the back of a narrow canyon in the western part of the village, are all but bare. Scrubby cypress varieties, mainly hinoki and sawara, struggle to stay afloat in seas of dwarf bamboo whose hardy stalks thrive on the open, sunny slopes left after clear cutting. In the same area, post-war efforts at reforestation are evidenced by rectangular metal signs that indicate the year in which sections were planted. And when I would visit this area, you would see signs that indicated trees planted 15, 20, 25, 30 years previously. And I was always shocked to see how poorly they had done. They were barely taller than I was. So the project did not seem to be going very well. The trouble, as several residents explained to me, is that government foresters planted only kane ni naruki, or trees that will become money, meaning timber varieties that could later be cut and sold. Interestingly, part of this was also because of a financial structure in which citizens were sort of buying bonds based in future timber sales. And the Forestry Agency, even to this day, is struggling to pay those investments back. The problem, at least in areas like this, is that such varieties don't grow well on the steep exposed slopes without soil that has been enriched by other biological material, namely the leaves and deadfall of deciduous trees. So because of this mass conversion from complex to simple forests, the areas are not ecologically adapted to these types of trees anymore. In other parts of the village, Japanese larch, or katamatsu, dominates the landscape. Katamatsu is a deciduous conifer that grows quickly and loves open areas of sunlight, so it's fairly well adapted to these clear-cut areas. Also, given its ability to rapidly reproduce stalks of timber, it grows very quickly. It was widely planted across the Kiso Valley region in the post-war period to meet the needs of reconstruction. However, because of the decline in domestic timber markets that I previously mentioned, most of this katamatsu has never been harvested, and so huge tracts of it remain across the Kiso Valley region today. It's problematic in part because katamatsu lack deep root systems, which are important for slope stabilization. And so in the early summer monsoonal rainy season in the Kiso Valley region, landslides have become increasingly ubiquitous. It's a problem for the entire region, other parts of Japan as well. However, despite the actual ecological conditions of national forests, Japan's Forestry Agency today touts them as national treasures, kuni no zaisan, that are managed to maintain various ecological functions for the benefit of the national citizenry. In a variety of media, Japan's Forestry Agency liberally employs terms such as citizens' forests, kokumin no mori, and everyone's forests, or minna no shinrin, like I have shown here. These terms signify that all national forests belong to the nation and its citizens as a whole. Interestingly, when I first began inquiring about national forests in Otaki with residents, one woman I spoke to referred to them as kuni no mon. Those are the nation's things. And so this phrase, kuni no mono, kuni no mon, was something that I heard repeated by a lot of residents. This particular woman continued, dakara watashi ni ammari kankei nai. So they don't really have anything to do with us. And this was shocking to me and sort of prompted further inquiries, but immediately I was seeing there was some sort of disconnect between these landscapes and local people. In brochures, pamphlets, email magazines, and on websites, forests in the Kiso region are presented as natural resources, accompanied by descriptions of beneficial functions which readers are to assume the Forestry Agency is managing them to promote. These lists are comprised of the same forests that provide the same eco-functions that I introduced at the beginning of the talk. So again, water and land protection, forest and people coexistence forests, which are my favorite. Those are recreation forests, essentially. For some reason, those forests are more amicable to human species, I guess, and so you can interact with them. And then the final are resource cycling forests, which are essentially timber production forests, where the logic is that trees will be sustainably cut and replanted, so there's a sort of recycling that happens there. So national forests, in other words, are offered up as eco-functional natures, and these are natures that, in the words of political scientist Timothy Luke, can be, quote, disassembled, recombined, and subjected to the disciplinary design of expert management. Framed in this manner, anthropologist Jim Igoe suggests that, quote, nature is increasingly presented as an eco-functional medium which can be recalibrated to optimize economic growth and ecosystem health. So it's worth noting here that scholars have described this kind of neoliberalization of nature in which rationalization, finance, and trade schemes and marketization are trumpeted as pathways to sustainability and ultimately to the ideals of green capitalism, and they've done so in contexts around the globe. So the use of these kinds of eco-functional nature spectacles is not unique to Japan, but rather they're informed by and contribute to what Leslie Sklar labels the Sustainable Development Historic Bloc and describes as a hegemonic agenda premised on scientific and market-based solutions to environmental crises, which increasingly permeates global understandings of ecosystems. Elsewhere, David Harvey has talked about environmental or spatial fixes, I should say, and I also see these very much rooted in that type of process whereby capital is attempting to market and profit off the previous sort of destruction that had been done to ecological systems. So I suggest that eco-functional forest natures have appeared in the Kiso Valley region and across Japan as part of larger shifts in governance towards conservation and management. And these shifts have occurred amidst political economic trends away from timber production and thus have been accompanied by declining budgets within the Forestry Agency as well as losses of human labor. So in response to these trends, the agency has worked to reconfigure itself as a natural resource management institution and to remake forests as natural resources belonging to and in the service of the national citizenry as a whole. And I don't have time to get into it in this talk, but there is a financial scheme behind all this in which forest timber production had been funding that agency, and so the shift was something that was required. I should clarify here that my contention is not that the occasional pamphlet, website, email, newsletter, or poster produced and circulated by the Forestry Agency is driving understandings of forest natures, or even national forest natures, among a national audience. They don't even have an Instagram account, I've been checking. What I do suggest, however, is that these productions are embedded within and informed by a larger accumulation of nature spectacles that circulate at a variety of scales. So in Japan, images and discourses of nature, as well as of rural landscapes, are conveyed through a mediascape that includes at least television, movies, magazines, public advertisements, pamphlets, brochures, emails, social networking applications, and websites. And like other industrial and post-industrial nations, images and discourses of nature dominate Japanese landscapes at multiple scales. Nearly any physical surface has been or is liable to be co-opted for the dissemination of images and discourses. So for example, as I'm sure many in this room will know, the interior of trains in Japan, metropolitan areas in particular, but almost anywhere in Japan, is going to be littered with both moving and still images that are trying to sell a variety of products and are often using these types of images in them. At the same time, of course, these public images and discourses are now battling for attention against an increasing proliferation of portable electronic devices as well. And within this mass of images and discourses, nature in rural areas are overwhelmingly represented as pristine and bucolic spaces, imagined and imaged as both exotic and familiar, or what Christine Yano describes as ironic frontiers, distant and peripheral places that are enlisted to serve as center spaces of contemplation. These representations of rurality and nature are also wrapped up in what Marilyn Ivy describes as discourses of the vanishing, within which objects, spaces, and places imagined as part of Japan's past are caught in a constant process of going away or of vanishing. In particular, notions of furusato are frequently employed when referencing nature in rural areas. And the concept of furusato invokes images of traditional villages, pure nature, that frequently prompt sensations of nostalgia and longing for an imagined past. So while the vanishing of upland communities is lamented in Japan today, I suggest that this only further valorizes them and their natural landscapes as recovered national treasures. So what I'm suggesting here is that nature and rurality are also wrapped up in notions of a Japanese national culture which informs popular imaginings of the nation and a common national identity. So in this vein, Japan's natural and rural environments are fetishized as spaces that are disconnected from the conditions of modern life and thus offer possibilities for connection or reconnection through practices of consumption, travel and tourism, or financial and other types of support. Just recently, in the last couple of years, the government's introduced a new tax scheme in which individuals can direct specific parts of their taxes to rural communities of their choosing, and there might be some gifts that are returned to you if you do that. That system is called the Furusato Noze, or the Furusato tax. In a similar fashion, nature spectacles produced and circulated by the Forestry Agency invite connection through specific actions. Again, tourism or perhaps volunteering opportunities to volunteer, but more generally through appeals to citizenship and a common national cultural identity. In his 1967 work, Society of the Spectacle, Marxist theorist and filmmaker Guy Debord forwards the argument that a modern society's relations between people are mediated by an accumulation of images and discourses, so that, quote, lived reality is materially invaded by the contemplation of the spectacle. Debord's contention is simply that humans' direct interactions with one another and with the world have been replaced by representations. In a series of essays, and most recently in his book, Nature of Spectacle, Jim Igoe draws on Debord's theorizations to include mediations of relations between people and environments, particularly in contexts of conservation. He suggests that analyzing these mediations and their effects, quote, requires moving beyond simple dichotomies of representation and material reality. So, in considering the role of images and discourses within assemblages of nature governance in Japanese national forests, I draw upon both DeBoer's and Igoe's work with the aim of a more dialogical engagement with the ideational and the material, not trying to put causal force specifically in either of those domains. I suggest that images and discourses are key components of national forest governance in the Kiso Valley region, due not only to their capacity to represent environments and to convey management policy and practice, but also, and more importantly, due to their capacity to invade lived reality, to shape material environments, and to bring both landscapes and subjects into being. DeBoer states that, quote, understood in its totality, the spectacle is both the result and the project of the present mode of production. It is not a mere supplement or decoration added to the real world. It is the heart of this real society's unreality. And here his assertion is that due to a constant and ongoing bombardment of representations, individuals lose the ability to directly access the world outside of the current mode of production. I think this is increasingly the case in our time, in which our analog lives and digital lives are frequently collapsing in on one another in ways that sort of blur that boundary even more. So DeBoer suggests that the spectacle then appears as, quote, omnipresent affirmation of the choices that have already been made in the sphere of production and in the consumption implied by that production. So in this talk, I have pointed to the historical production of landscapes of resources in the Kiso Valley region as this, quote, choices, the choices that have already been made. And I've argued that nature spectacles work to affirm those choices. So I'd like to move towards my conclusion by discussing one final critical assemblage component, which is the emergence of human subjects who are able to confirm the reality of nature spectacles through their mediated interactions with environments. And I do this with an analysis of Makio Dam, a multi-purpose dam completed in 1961 that sits in the eastern part of Otaki. So Makio was first conceived of by two agriculturalists from Aichi Prefecture, just south of the Kiso Valley, who recognized the possibilities that technological interventions held for bringing water to drought-prone communities in their area. Due in large part to their imaginings as well as their lobbying efforts, Makio Dam and an accompanying canal system were completed remarkably fast in just 4 years after construction had started. Post-war ideals of US-style democracy swirled around the dam project, which was funded by the World Bank and modeled on the Tennessee Valley Authority as a way to foster Ryuiki Minshuka, or river basin democratization, or watershed democratization. The idea was to transport water from the Kiso Valley to drought-prone communities south of that area. The ideological and financial weight that quickly gathered around the Makio Dam project was enough to assemble together material environments, technologies, and people in a way that imbued the project with sensations of urgency as well as inevitability. Since the majority of forests in the proposed submersion zone were governed by the Forestry Agency, with a little help from local, regional, and national politicians, arrangements were easily made to relocate rail lines and to create a compensation scheme for trees that would be inundated. Makio was to be Japan's largest rock-filled dam to date, and so heavy equipment as well as water engineering expertise were imported from the US to help move the project forward. Otaki residents were, of course, acutely aware of the potential impacts of the dam, and so opposition movements, or Hantai Undo, took place in the village throughout the project planning process. In 1952, the head of Otaki's main dam opposition group said in part about the project, quote, development that benefits only downstream Aichi Prefecture and for which there is no positive benefit whatsoever for local areas cannot be called integrated development, or Sogo Kaihatsu, which was a sort of mantra that was surrounding this project. However, an imposing aggregation of capital, political power, and technological means which had fomented around the Makio project easily drowned out these voices of protest that were coming from residents. And what's more, even as Buraku Kaisanshiki, or Hamlet dissolution ceremonies, were being held for communities in the submersion zone, subjects were emerging who recognized themselves as national citizens, called upon to sacrifice in order to meet regional needs as well as national aspirations. So this poem, entitled Dam, by 6th grader Yasue Chikako, whose home was in the submersion zone, is illustrative of this. And here I translate. I was surprised to hear that the area around my house would become a dam. There's no reason to make the dam since there are so many households like mine. I hated the people who decided to make the dam. Every day I was all messed up. But now it's different. Over there are many people who are in trouble without enough water. So if they make a dam here where I happily depart, everyone will be better. I can't be selfish and think only of myself. It's for the benefit of everyone. Chikako's poem gives some shape to the sentiments that swirled around the Makyo Dam project, imbuing it with understandings of progress and democracy, as well as demanding sensations of sacrifice and national duty, even from those who were to be most impacted. In his book, Toxic Archipelago, environmental historian Brett Walker speaks in similar terms regarding the embodied pains of victims of industrial disease in Japan. He notes that, quote, pain is transformed into a form of less than dignified, and certainly not always empathetically shared, sacrifice for the nation. Such an understanding of pain and sacrifice, Walker suggests, is more easily recognized than are the world-destroying impulses of industrial or resource development projects. So ideologically, Makyo Dam and the river basin democratization it would facilitate were for the good of the nation, and as national citizens, residents of Otaki were asked to accept the social and ecological havoc that would be wreaked upon their village. In the years since the dam's completion, I suggest the village residents have come to understand themselves as dwellers in a landscape that has been recast as Suigenchi, a source water area or a source water land. During a 2009 interview, the head of the local forestry agency office in Otaki described the institution's mandate pertaining to the management of the roughly 24,000 hectares, or approximately 59,000 acres, of national forest that blankets most of Otaki's land area in the following way, and here again I translate. Now, perhaps the most important points laid out are what we call functions for the public good, what we might call the foundations that allow national citizens to live safely. Things like protecting water at source water areas, or runoff. If soil and sand flow into the rivers, dams will become filled in and they will lose their function. Then water used for rice fields and for drinking will be lost. The function of the dam itself will be lost. So we do our jobs in line with this most important point. Forest maintenance so that sand and soil doesn't flow down. Forest maintenance to create those kinds of forests. In this official's assessment, which mimicked agency policies, it's clear that the role of forests in Otaki had become to protect dams so that they can provide water for the public good and the safety of national citizens. So it's not surprising then that today in Otaki the vast majority of forest lands are categorized and managed as water and soil conservation forests, Suido Hozenbi. These forests, according to the Forestry Agency, function to, quote, provide abundant water and purify the air, which is necessary for life. And elsewhere, the Forestry Agency makes it explicit that this type of forest making, or shinin zukuri, is for protecting the life or livelihood of the national citizenry. Kokumin no seikatsu o momoru tame. So much like with deployments of the term minna, everyone, that I mentioned previously, consistent ideological linkages between national forests and national citizens presented in the form of eco-functional nature spectacles such as Suido Hozenbin contribute to the assemblage work of bringing together water, trees, people, and the nation itself. The resultant landscapes, which appear to conform to the spectacles, as well as people who subjectively confirm them, help to make the spectacular real. Circulating at national levels, spectacles also serve to convert specific local forest ecologies in the Kiso Valley to generalized national forests, suturing them to the over 7.5 million hectares, or close to 19 million acres of national forests across the archipelago that are attributed the same, mainly three, eco-functions. So forests are thus wrested from their local context and remade so that they appear to cohere with the national level management agendas. Established as the heart of the real society's unreality, nature spectacles in the Kiso Valley take on the power to erase histories of forest and water resource exploitation, as well as their own emergence from those histories, in favor of images and discourses of natural resources linked to notions of common national culture, democracy, governance, safety, and citizenship. So to reiterate my central argument, nature spectacles are critical to natural resource governance projects in Japan in that they present plausible realities and coherent landscapes that interact with material environments in ways that obscure historical, political economies of resource extraction and the resultant precariousness of local ecologies. The case of Makio Dam points to the power of nature spectacles to mediate relations between humans and the worlds they inhabit. So in this respect, within post-war regimes of natural resource governance in the Kiso Valley, nature spectacles are both the project and the result of the assemblage work that has brought material environments, governance institutions, scientific knowledge, national imaginings, and images together as coherent landscapes from which have emerged subjects, particularly at the local level, who recognize themselves not so much as losers in a political ecology of resource extraction, but as national citizens and participants in national projects of natural resource development, management, and governance. So I'd like to conclude by returning to this image of Tajika-san that I began with. And while in my talk today I've been focused on uses of nature spectacle to produce forests that are meant to be seen and that work to conceal actual lived realities, in my larger book project I describe forests in Otaki and the Kiso Valley region as being unseen, by which I mean that though not widely visible beyond local scales, they are comprised by vibrant ecologies and spaces of direct encounter that are productive of alternative ways of knowing and living. So hope is not completely lost, at least I hope. When national forests become spectacle, the dwellers in the ecological communities that enliven them lose visibility and viability within the national body. And this unseenness, however, I believe, should not prevent scholars and others from attending to these spaces and to the happenings within them. And I think there needs to be much more of this in the Japanese context. So while I place great value on critical interrogations of assemblages that thwart our attempts to see forests and other natures as they truly are, I find equal value in tracking emergent encounters and the possibilities of what Anna Tsing describes as collaborative survival amongst the ruins of capitalism. So as it pertains to environmental and sustainability studies in Japanese context, while I don't think it's necessary, and while I myself do not intend to put down the hatchets of critique, it is my hope that scholars, activists, and others will equally attend to the many seeds of possibilities that lie frequently unseen in forests and other environments across the archipelago. Thank you. I'd be happy to hear comments, questions that you might have.
We've got about, so what time is it? Okay, so we have a good 40 minutes. But we have to be out of this room apparently right at 12:30 because some other group is coming in.
Yeah, it sounds like food will be launched at us.
But we do have a good amount of time, so if you wouldn't mind taking your own questions.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ann Walfallen. I love the Kiso Valley, it's such but only from a very superficial tourist point of view. But my recollection of its history is that from very early on, much of the forests were not controlled by local inhabitants, but were controlled by the shogunate in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century, and then taken over as imperial forests, as you mentioned, in the Meiji period.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm wondering is, for people like those in Otaki Village, how do they make a living? I mean, how do they make a living, and how do they make a living now?
Yeah, so in the past, in the Edo period in particular, the Owari Han, the Owari clan, did control most forests in the region.
But on behalf of the shogunate.
Yes, on behalf, yeah, and right, and that sort of develops through time as well. Karin Vegan's work about Shinano and sort of trade networks that developed in that region, though not dealing specifically with timber production, I think hint at similar things that were happening in terms of there was timber being sent downriver and then finding its way over to Edo. And so there was that production system. Local production systems were based on usufruct rights of being able to go in and gather, all sorts of non-timber forest products. And indeed, there was a term that I frequently heard used, ki ippon kubi hitotsu. So if you cut one tree, we're going to cut one neck. And I never found, I mean, I was sort of just in local archives in the Kiso Valley, and that wasn't the bulk of my research. I never found any factual accounts of that happening, yet people were talking about it all the time. I did find one account of a crucifixion to a tree to sort of send out a message like, don't touch the Lord's trees. But so that seems to be the big shift, is that the Meiji government claims these lands and then takes control, you know, in a more firm way of saying you cannot use these for anything, for timber production or for charcoal making or anything else. Other funny stories though about when the Meiji official would come around to do a forest inventory. He might come in late in the afternoon, much like I did here. They might ply him with a little bit of sake or a lot of sake, and who the hell wants to go climb a mountain when you're hungover the next morning? So one of these tricks to sort of prevent that. So production systems, sorry to get back to your question. So at that time it was largely, people were producing food just for their own consumption. Soba, mainly rice, has never been grown in Otaki. And hunting as well, bear hunting was and continues to be a practice that is widespread in the village. And then once industrialized forestry begins to happen, people begin getting jobs with the government, working as train drivers, as lumbermen and other things. So today in the village, actually people talk about times of industrialized forestry as the Furukiyoki, as the good old days, because there was lots of money and people had, you know, the village was big and there was lots of people and lots of kids running around. So it's kind of contradictory in that way, I think, but for me points to, again, the conversion of production systems, right? Whether it's sort of looking like things are good, the conversion of those into these larger markets frequently has unintended consequences.
I'm just wondering, if you took the population graph of the village from an earlier date, would it show a continual decline, or would it show a gradual population increase during industrialized forestry?
It shows a population increase, yeah. So there was actually a Ninya Kyoku Ku, so a hamlet of just forestry office families that lived there. So that was a big spike in the population.
So it hasn't always been declining.
Yeah, which I think is another really important point, is that the narrative is sort of about decline, and surely these communities are declining, but you look back and the stable population of humans for many, many years was not, you know, really, really big. And so I think there's also a way to kind of rethink what sustainability looks like for these types of communities, what community maintenance looks like for them today.
I did enjoy your talk. It was very good.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I think there was one other question here.
Yeah, if I could, I'll try to make a coherent question, and first of all, to kind of jump off of where you and Ann were just talking, this notion of a forestry village. I recently wrote about a Taiwanese novel that talks about a Japanese forestry village that was kind of faded and morphed into a native Taiwanese village over the years. But to come back to your discussion of assemblage and what you hinted at the beginning of your period talk, the affective economy, and Marilyn Ivy's work, which also kind of dovetails into what I've been looking at in Taiwan. There seems to be this shift from kind of a search for an interest in old cultures, and suddenly we have this jump to looking for old forests. I'm to kind of ask you to help me with a class I'm teaching right now. We're looking at Gao Xingjian's novel, Soul Mountain, which deals with this guy who's been diagnosed with lung cancer, but then he finds out he's not got lung cancer, and he heads up into the mountains in search of a primeval forest. And the novel kind of bounces between his encounters with old villagers and old culture, and he's trying to make this leap to the primeval forest. And your discussion of assemblage and ivy and these old forests and scale in particular, I hope you're still with me. Could you talk a little bit about how one makes this movement from an old culture, as Anne has brought up? How are people living, and then how do we make this jump to primeval forests or old forests or forests that are not there simply for producing lumber? And if I've missed this, if that's what your talk was all about, and I completely missed the point, I apologize.
No. Well, so I think
guess
that
effective economies is kind of.
So I think the affective ecologies framework is important for thinking about that. Anand Singh's recent book about mushrooms circulating around the globe and the way that different bodies are coming together and contaminating one another, as she puts it, but creating new worlds, new ways of living. I think that's important to think about, and that's the space that I'm trying to carve out with the idea of the unseen forest. I didn't get to speak as much to it today, but just to, interestingly, this is a series of images now that are on the Forestry Agency, the local branch office in the Kiso Valley, photographic points for katamatsu, the crappy trees that grow quickly. But so one time when I was with a tour operator in Otaki, he was bemoaning tourists and how they wanted to see these tsumaranai mori, these boring forests, right? That because he knows that they're so recent and they're not sort of they're not the forests that these people are looking for. So I think both of those things maybe exist at the same time, and then both the seen forest and the unseen, and then we need to try to pay attention and help think of ways for both us as scholars and activists and people at the local level to attune themselves to enduring aspects of their communities as well as new emergences in ways that I think are more intentional about what they want the community and the landscape around them to be. Part of the issue in Otaki is that this kind of drive for tourism that's sort of based on nothing except for tourist imaginaries of like, these are beautiful Japanese forests. Well, yeah, they are beautiful, but there's a history there. Skiing was the other big tourist industry that after Makio Dam was built, there was actually a bunch of money given to the village office as compensation for the land that they lost. National government at that time was rural communities need to do tourism, that's going to be the thing, and so they built the ski hill. And then as a ski boom picked up in Japan, they added on to that ski hill and added on and added on and added on. That ski hill has been a sort of watermark moment in the village because it got them into financial debt, which came to a head in 2005 in the last round of municipal amalgamations, when everybody else in the Kiso Valley said, thanks, but no thanks, we don't want you as part of our city. And I think people in Otaki are now happy about that because they still have their autonomy in some sense. And so I think that's kind of in my conversations with residents in Otaki what I like to point out to them, that what are the ways forward? And I don't know that imagining it as a going back to something is going to be effective, because I think they're always going to lose in that sort of narrative. They're always going to be the marginal community. I hope my answer made sense to the...
Yeah. Well, I hope we have an opportunity to discuss this one.
Definitely.
And thank you very much for your talk.
And I promise I'll come to your class and try to help out.
Oh,
too.
you missed it. It was yesterday.
Oh, no. Next time. All right.
Thank you for an excellent talk.
Thanks.
I'm thrilled to be in the presence of a fellow Ringyo otaku.
Oh no, I never thought of it that way.
Well,
It's all coming together.
it takes one to know one.
Yeah.
My question, I guess I'm wondering to what extent your approach to assemblages extends beyond the archipelago itself. It seems to me, at least as I perceive it, that within Japan studies and Japanese environmental humanities, the real unseen forests are those in Indonesia and the Philippines and across Southeast Asia that are under the operation of Sumitomo Ringyo, Oji Paper Company, and all of the extensive network of what Anna Singh calls odorless capital that connects everything back to the archipelago without offering any sense of Japan's actual involvement in those lumbering operations. I mean, by the 1990s, Japan was at the center of the firestorm over the bad harvests in Southeast Asia.
Mhm.
There's a brewing controversy now about the sourcing of the timber used for the stadium for the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, coming from unsustainable forestry practices in Malaysia. So I guess I'm wondering to what extent do you in the book or more broadly do you place the communities that you look at in the Kiso Valley alongside shifting cultivators in Kalimantan? I mean, is there an opportunity to kind of more fully integrate the archipelago within broader landscapes and material flows?
Mm-hmm.
And to what extent does Japan's sort of credentials as a country with a rich conservationist history? I mean, the Japanese invoke their traditions of their Mori no Bunka, the ideas of Iriai and Furusato, to sort of distinguish themselves on the global scale as a leader in reforestation practices and conservation. How does that inform their sort of the broader ecological footprint that extends beyond the archipelago?
Yeah, it's a great question, thank you. So in the scope of the book, I don't sort of materially go to those forests, right, to think about like what Seo and Taylor talk about, the process of dual decay in which both upland communities in Japan and these communities around the globe in which deforestation is happening because of this voracious appetite for manga and disposable chopsticks and everything else, right? So it's there, and I think it's important to attend to and sort of more widely. I definitely think about it. Within the scope of the book, it happens in terms of the discursive arrangements that you also spoke to, meaning Japan specifically sort of greenwashing itself, if you will, as the eco-friendly nature, or the eco-friendly nation, right, the green archipelago. And so I guess I see my work as trying to fill in the backside of that story to look at how communities domestically in Japan as well have been, their structure, even though it looks green, that's the kind of spectacle operating that these landscapes appear as eco-functional natures, and yet even green can be unsustainable, right? And sort of try to uncover those stories a little bit. And so I guess it's fundamentally connected to what you're talking about, that larger process of the assemblage. And theoretically, I see it as most definitely incorporating those global flows as well. So I incorporate those more on the level of discourses, but less on sort of looking materially at how environments or ecologies are being shaped in other countries.
Do the villagers in the community that you did your fieldwork in, to what extent do they invoke their own history and tradition of forestry? Do all roads lead back to the nation? Or do they still do they retain any sense of sort of regional forestry practices or Iriai traditions?
They do, actually. I have the slide with me today. I think I do. Yeah, and another, I've done some work with spatial technologies, and so using GIS mapping, for example, you can begin to get a sense of how ecologies differ in terms of, because there are village-owned forests even to this day, and if you overlay maps of those, they tend to line up very nicely with human habitation sites. And so, in other words, the clear cutting and industrialized forestry is happening in the Okuyama, or the back far reaches of the forest, and local people, at least, I mean, still to a certain extent, are gathering their mushrooms, other leaf litter, even to a certain extent. Some people making charcoal more as a cultural practice than as a necessity of life. But so one function of that is that the ecological system is sort of flip-flopped, and that the Okuyama now is devoid of biological material for non-human beings to consume, bears and monkeys and these sorts of animals of where they want to consume. And so now they're down at the the margins of the village. So there's sort of been an ecological shift there. In terms of the way that people speak about those the sort of traditional life ways, most of it that I encountered is in connection to Ontake-san, that sacred mountain. And so prior to, I mean, it still exists today, but prior to particularly the building of the ski hill, the one way that cash was coming into Otaki was through that mountain. There's sort of a spiritual ecology, if you will, a spiritual economy linked to pilgrimage up to that mountain. And so even today you'll find ryokan down in the village, inns that are linked with a specific shrine that's at the base, and then has mountain huts, now just at the summit of the mountain. But so in the past there was a whole sort of network, both ecological and economic. So people talk about that a lot. In 2014, in September, unfortunately, Ontake-san unexpectedly erupted and killed over 50 climbers who were on the mountain at the time, sort of tourists. And so that was a big shock and a kind of destabilizing moment. I describe it in another article that I see as a kind of maybe new watermark where people might start rethinking what dwelling in this particular landscape is, right? If we can't do tourism, at least for the foreseeable future, related to mountaineering, and even ski tourism is kind of, there was a whole hullabaloo about you're making money off of dead bodies, essentially, you know, the death of people, and how can you be skiing on this mountain, and religious communities that use that mountain sort of have that as well. So Otaki now is at a bit of a place that seems precarious, but I think back to the previous question, I see that there's also possibilities there for rethinking ways of doing and living in that village. It would be nice if there was more young people there to help implement some of this stuff.
Can I just jump in for 1 minute?
Sure.
Your photographs, I noticed you began with the photograph of the old guy clearing away the debris looking for a date, but two of your other photographs have kind of shown, if not only a man, but I mean, here we have what appears to be a woman and 2 children.
Yeah.
Your other photograph looks like a large group of people. There seems to be, both men and women involved. Did you, with your research, is there some sort of differing engagement with, is some sort of a gender element, men engaged with this as opposed to women engaged with this? I would think a lot of the government forestry is kind of a male-dominated, but how are women in the local community becoming involved with this project?
It's a really good question. Yeah, I think doing a prolonged analysis with gender as sort of the primary framework of that analysis would be very interesting in the village. So my comments are sort of more anecdotal, but in terms of specific activities, or what I would call environmental care labor, to promote the village, or to take groups of people out to pathways that used to be part of this larger complex associated with the sacred mountain. You find a mix of participants, but a lot of the heavy lifting, if you will, is being done by women in the village. To the point where, like, when I first got there, I was always asking people what do the men do all day? Because the women do a lot of the agriculture as well. And you do have sort of traditional gender roles at, planning events, for example. The men are going to get together and for like 30 minutes and then start drinking, and then the women are going to serve food and then clean up after and things like that. All the while, because I was sort of floating in between those two worlds, I'm okay to wash a dish here and there, was understanding that there was sort of communication and planning happening, that the men sort of drinking sake and talking in official terms was always more performance, I think, than it was substance for what was actually happening. That being the case, thinking of Dr. Long, of your work, I mean, I think sort of digging into that a little bit more would be really intriguing, because the sort of official power dynamics are definitely that men are in charge. Any elected office is for the most part men. There's one woman that sits on the village council, but all the sort of official political stuff is men.
I've got so many questions. I'm going to try and combine two of them.
Okay.
So one is kind of like a Nagano question, and one is more of a theory question, and maybe I can combine them. So the Nagano question is, when I was trying to study Kamanaga Hitomi's post 311 documentaries, and she's also very interested in the way that harm and precarity were offloaded onto these local communities that are now forced to bear the burden, even while their subjectivity is organized into this sort of nationalist celebration. So it's a really hard site from which to extract the hope. That I love the way you ended, with that. But Shio had said, Fukushima is. It's really hard to go into those places with documentaries and do kind of the kind of subjectivity shifts that would allow activism to happen, because the tradition of dependence on nuclear power is so old. But she always says, but if you go to someplace like Nagano, there they have the activists. So I'm wondering if there's like during the time in your village, if you were aware of people making connections to other places in Nagano, or if it's possible to just drive 2 hours and have a completely different sense of our relation to the state and to these discourses. And so that was question number one.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll wait on question number two. No, so not to.
Yeah, so the sort of short answer to that is that I partly because of the geography of Nagano, yes, very much you can drive to a different community and then it's suddenly quite different, right? Nagano's a very large prefecture as well, so maybe all the radicals are up north, I don't know.
You haven't met them though.
Yeah, well, you kind of find like hippies out in the woods. I actually have a friend now who just was, he married a girl from Otaki, and they're living in another valley now, but they had just organized a sort of Marxist how do rural communities relate to political economy in the cities type of workshop thing. So yeah, I think it does exist. Otaki seems to be more of the former, right? That there's been a dependence, that it's sort of it's been ideal in terms of post-war political strategies of pacifying, for lack of a better word, rural communities by giving them just enough. Like when the ski hill was booming, during the ski boom, right, up until the bubble burst in the early 90s, people would talk about I'm sure they were over-exaggerating, but stories of like stuffing Ichiman and Satsu into bags, right, and carrying them down to the village office. They used to send the entire junior high school in Ninensei, the second grade class, send them to Australia, all expenses paid. Just sort of the classic sort of rural irrational spending, if you will. Building giant gymnasiums that are now sitting and rotting. There's tennis courts throughout the village because there was a tennis boom at some point, this sort of thing. So I don't know that there's sort of been a following along of just whatever comes next, we'll sort of figure it out that way. And people will talk a lot about, like, if only, this professor could come from Todai and give us some good ideas, or and this sort of thing. At the same time, you would find people once in a while, Tajika-san, who I started out with, he had enough knowledge about, what had happened with forests there and the mountain and things, that he had a very critical edge to the way he spoke about the government. This idea of the Kaneni Naruki, people knew that forestry agency officials were just kind of BS. They're always young, and they cycle in like 3-year cycles, so they don't really know the local environment. And same thing with teachers to a certain extent. People were sort of frustrated with how local children were never learning anything about the local environment and sort of ways of life and stuff like that. So it's there. I guess another line of thinking that I've had recently is, I worry about a sort of narrative that constantly tells people in rural communities that you need to fight for your dying village, right? So you need to go work and try to, you're working 3 jobs just to have enough money to do this and that, and then afterwards you should organize a committee to like revamp this or that, right? All this extra labor that we're sort of asking. And so sometimes I wonder, is there kind of not a different poetics of decline and dying? Like maybe some villages just want to not keep fighting, or to allow the remaining time that they have in the landscapes that they've existed in to be good. So I'm not committed to that yet. It's just sort of an idea that I've been toying with, but I do think it's a hard sell.
That connects really directly to my theory question, so if it's okay, I'll just ask that. Sounds like what you find yourself thinking about when you think about what the alternative is to asking people to take on the 4th job of activism is Anna Tsing's collaborative survival within ruined ecologies. But that's not. I guess I want to ask you to talk a little bit about theory and about what anthropology in particular brings to issues of environmental humanities, especially when we seem to be up against these massive forces of resource extraction, neoliberal despair, and climate collapse. And yet, in the university, when we have the freedom to try and think what is to be done, how did you wind up going with Guy Debord as opposed to Anna Tsing for your keywords and your title? And what do you see happening in anthropology, given that we have this very complex set of things to attend to, hope being one, without which probably we can't do anything?
Okay. Right, so, and I'm borrowing from Igo's work here, his use of thinking with Debord, and also Anna Tsing, he sort of sees as the twin intellectual trajectories in his work. And that's because, Debord was quite, Debord was, in the 1960s, he was a radical sort of filmmaker and performer, and headed this group, the Situationists International, and sort of saw the spectacle, the society of the spectacle, as really this overbearing and impossible to escape reality unless you kind of can find authentic ways to live and to again directly access the world and other people. And so they would sort of stage there was kind of conversations they'd have about walking around Paris with no sort of specific way to direction that you were going, or sort of looking for just happenings to occur. So I don't share Debord's cynicism of nature's spectacles. I don't think that they're fully an all-encompassing, completed project. And I think for me, in terms of thinking through assemblage, and anthropologists, including Anna Tsing, are definitely using assemblage in that way, to think of both the ways that it can contain and it can sort of create realities that are material and ideational and that draw forth subjectivities, but the ways in which we can also attend to how those things can shift, and often shift quite quickly, right? That things can, new lines of flight can occur, and new possibilities can come into being. And so in Ōtaki, in particular, as well as other communities where I'm starting to do research, I've also begun to think more of landscapes in a sort of palimpsestic fashion as material environments in which different modes of production or ways of doing have been inscribed upon them in different ways. And so in Ōtaki, for example, right, if you go out to one of these areas, this is a pathway that used to go from a community called Kashimo that's in Gifu, and then it goes over the tops of mountains, or over a mountain ridge into Otaki. And there's a series of statues of Kannon that local people were trying to find and recover these and sort of reestablish this pathway. And so I saw that as a really interesting project, right? And wondered, what is this maybe going to bring into being? What sort of new worlds might emerge from this? And so initially you were getting just connections between these two villages that it turns out used to have marriage connections in the past. So you were finding Miura-san in both sides of it. And so I think another thing too, at least in the context of Japan, that anthropology brings to these types of debates is grounded ethnography, right? Going out and talking to people, walking these pathways, getting a sense of what is there on the ground, in the hopes of developing, and this is coming from a conversation I had recently with an anthropologist, Scott Schnell, who does work in upland communities as well, but really taking more seriously the top-down perspective in Japan. In other words, the upland communities that have in many ways, they sort of don't match the narrative, the modern, or the dominant narrative of modern Japan, particularly post-war Japan, that's very much lowland driven, right? Even things like rice, again, in Otaki, people don't eat rice, even to this day they don't really eat rice. So the sort of rice as self is, a lot of bread actually, they bake things, they make, there's a lot of donguri acorns, and they pulverize those and dry it and make a powder, and they'll have donguri pan, donguri bread, buckwheat, a lot of buckwheat, things that grow better at a high altitude. And so I think beginning to highlight those different worlds that have existed, right? It's not even always necessarily that these are things coming into being, but how can we highlight those stories and again help communities begin to think about what futures might look like in ways that don't always pit them as just marginal communities holding on at the edges. And so in my thinking about tourism, and for my second project, that's really a main question that I asked there is, how in different communities are people answering this question of how do you move into the future, how do you maintain a community, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
So if I'm curious about this tourism thing. If you have tourism, you have to have neighbors.
So their big one is akakabu, which is a type of turnip, a red turnip that they pickle. But more interestingly, at least for me, is they have sunki, they call it, which is the top of the turnips, the leafy greens. And they pickle those, but it's not done with salt. They pickle it with what they call tane, which is taking the previous year's supply and setting some aside. And so you'll blanch these greens, and then you'll pile them with the previous year's. And then I asked once, well, what's in the original, like how does the original one get made? And they said it's stuff from the mountains, different things that, and nobody really knows. So these are culturally embedded. They go back generations in households. And so it's sort of, people enjoy also the different households. Sunki is always going to taste different, right, because they're all coming from different tane. But they continue to make that. They've just had a pretty hard time marketing outside the village because it's quite sour. And some people don't like it, but they've made attempts to market it as a no salt tsukemono, right? So that people don't get brain aneurysms, but it still hasn't done very well. So that's their meibutsu. Corn too. The corns are delicious.
So no handicrafts or wood products or any kind?
No, not for sale so much. Hegi is an interesting technique that they use. They used to use for making the shingles for their homes, where you'd have a round cut of a tree, and then you cut out quarter sections of it, and you cut down this way, and so you can make your roofing tiles out of wood. But then they would also do that thinner and thinner, and there's still a couple artisans who do that work. And making, like you'll sometimes see in a shrine, the roofs of it will be these hegi, thin slices of wood. Other places in the Kiso Valley are really famous for their lacquerware as well, so Urushi is a product, but not in Otaki.
I think it might be time to feed you a delicious lunch.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful questions. They're really